One of the B plots, you might say, of the second Trump administration is the president's aggressive anti-Canadian saber rattling. You're probably familiar with it at this point.
So I say, why are we doing this? Why are we willing to lose between $100 billion and $200 billion a year? We don't need them. As a state, it's different. As a state, it's much different.
I think most Americans tend to look at this as just something that our silly old deranged grandpa president is doing, nothing to take entirely seriously. But I think that's a huge mistake. I think it's important to look at this from the perspective of our Canadian neighbors. Now, it should be said here that Canada has been a reliable and stalwart ally of the United States for a century. They have been valuable economic partners. Obviously, many Americans live in Canada and many Canadians live in the United States. We're obviously two separate countries, but for much of our shared history, we've been on very friendly terms with each other. And that's despite the fact that a lot of Americans don't really know that much about Canada, which is a shame because it's an interesting country. Basically, our cousin, given that it too began life as a British colonial possession. Anyway, you have to consider all of this from the perspective of Canadians who see their closest neighbor, a global superpower with an enormous military, under the control of, again, a deranged, addled grandpa who consistently threatens to rob them of their sovereignty, who consistently threatens to use military force even to forcibly incorporate Canada into the United States, who has already launched wars of aggression against multiple countries, Venezuela and Iran, and they're planning one in Cuba, who already sees himself as some kind of king of a greater North America, who is desperate for territorial acquisition, who has threatened to take territory from other American allies, Denmark in this case, and who has begun to use the coercive levers of power to try to beat Canadians into submission. We over in the States haven't thought a lot about the president's tariffs that he slapped on Canada, and today he slapped an additional 50% tariff on certain Canadian goods, supposedly in retaliation for the fact that Canada didn't do enough to prevent the wildfires, but that's nonsense. Those tariffs have had a real and negative impact on the Canadian economy. Ordinary Canadians are suffering because of economic coercion from our government. And so we have economic coercion and consistent threats of territorial acquisition. Donald Trump's chud supporters might think it's funny and cute to post memes making Canada a 51st state, but actual Canadians find that genuinely threatening, as they should. It would be as if your neighbor, who has a key to your house even, was waving around a shotgun right in front of your face and has already shot two of your other neighbors. You can say, hey, maybe it's just kidding, maybe it's just joking, but you shouldn't plan on it. You should plan on it being quite serious. This is all to say, I think Americans should take the president's anti-Canadian saber rattling so much more seriously than we do. We should treat it not as a joke, not as a quirk, not as something not to take seriously, but as a genuine threat to our neighbors. We should consider what it looks like that Republican senators are even introducing legislation treating Canadian leaders as if they are terrorists, as if they are adversaries, and what the impact of an anti-Canadian line spreading through the Republican Party might be. We've played conflict with Canada for jokes in the past. There's a not terribly good movie called Canadian Bacon that it's all about a fictional war against Canada, drummed up for domestic political reasons.
I have the results from the overnight tracking.
It's not fair. I mean, every other president had all of the Russians to blame for everything. What have I got?
For an unpopular president,
The voters felt that your being alive or dead had no real bearing on their daily lives.
it's time to give war a chance.
Dead.
What are we going to do for an enemy now?
A riot between Americans and Canadians broke out last night.
Now, with a little inspiration,
All I said was Canadian beer sucks.
Give me 1 week and I'll have Americans burning maple leaves.
But this is not a gag, it's not funny, it's threatening. I do think that this is an area where Democratic politicians could stand to be a little louder, stand to let our Canadian neighbors know that we are taking these things very seriously. Because they are serious. They're, in fact, quite frightening. And if Canadian leaders and ordinary Canadians decide that they're just never going to trust the United States again, I wouldn't blame them.